watershed, I sit on the Toronto Conservation Authority. I also am involved in a number of subcommittees through the region of Peel, because in Mississauga, unlike in Toronto, Mississauga is part of a two-tier government. We are part of the region of Peel. So in the region of Peel, we have Mississauga, Caledon, and Brampton, and most of the watershed issues are dealt with through the conservation authorities, which are dealt with funding-wise through the region of Peel. I have personally, as the ward councillor, I have a vested interest in a watershed, in water management, in flood prevention, and overall climate change, because of the fact that I represent citizens, the 61,000 people that are in the ward. We're right on the Etobicoke Creek and the Little Etobicoke Creek. But in general, as a city and as a region, we have invested a great deal of money in and also policies and planning through the conservation authorities to deal with climate change, stormwater infrastructure, adaptation, prevention, and mitigation for quite a few years back, both through the Credit Valley Conservation Authority and also the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. As far as in Mississauga and how Mississauga and the region of Peel are dealing with extreme weather, I think I'll just give a little background. I think one of the very first steps and one of the turning points for Ontario, for all municipalities in Ontario, actually came when Hurricane Hazel hit. So not Mayor McCallion, but the actual Hurricane Hazel itself. And I say that because that storm had such great impact that it forced, I think it actually forced the province to look at what informally groups were doing, like citizen groups were doing around conservation, to form the Conservation Act. And at that time, that gave conservation authorities, there are 37 throughout the province, the authority to be able to, under legislation, to be able to go in and work and invest in flood mitigation, flood mapping, erosion control of the watershed, and then from there a whole variety of other services and commitments that the conservation authorities provide. So that was a huge turning point. The other reason why it was a turning point was because up until that point, municipalities were allowed to build basically anywhere. So you could build right on the creek of a river, you could build right up towards the lake, tributaries, whatever was happening upstream. Nobody really thought about how the impact that would have on downstream. And that really changed at that time because you weren't allowed to build in floodplains. So it changed also our whole approach to planning and development in municipalities. So I think that was a huge impact. And I want to say the conservation authorities, for sure Toronto Conservation Authority, Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and Credit Valley have been leaders all along in looking at ways to address climate change and how we need to adapt that for growing urban areas like in the GTA, like in Mississauga and Peel, and but also applying those to urban settings like Toronto, the city of Toronto. And they have done so, and they've been saying that and done so in very creative ways, because just as the province created the conservation authorities, they didn't necessarily help fund the conservation authorities to do their jobs. And at the same time, other legislation has been, with good intention I think, for developing urban areas. The province has developed other legislation like the Places to Grow Act, which has asked municipalities or tells municipalities that they need to plan development. So there's kind of this, I don't know if you want to say conflict, but over time different policies have been developed where you're looking at intensifying, but at the same time, how do you intensify in a way that's going to create a very livable urban environment, and at the same time respect the environment that we all love and we all take for granted to a certain extent. The conservation authorities have been telling us that. And so in Mississauga, I would say one of the biggest, there was a lot of development in a very short period of time in Mississauga. and also in the region of Peel. We continue to see that development now, not so much in Mississauga. There's a lot still development going on in Mississauga, but a lot of the greenfield development has already happened. But in Brampton, there's still quite a bit of development, and in Caledon. So upstream from us, quite a bit of development. And how that impacts the watersheds and how that impacts the overall infrastructure of all the municipalities is extremely important. It's important for the environment. How it's addressed is important for the environment, socially, but also physically and economically for the municipalities. A big storm that occurred, I think one of the first storms that occurred that Mississauga really had to look at in terms of the impacts on the watersheds and our stormwater infrastructure system was in 2009. I don't know if you remember, August, I think it was the 9th of August, 2009. I remember very well. I was actually out running on a trail in Mississauga, really close to the Etobicoke Creek. And when I left the house, it looked kind of gray. By the time I was like 30 minutes out there, it was like black. The storm came down, similar to what happened this July, but not quite as intense. But a lot of water all at once in a very short period of time, a lot of wind, and there was a lot of flooding. And Cooksville Creek was flooded, and Cooksville was flooded substantially in Mississauga. And out of that, it was determined we need to really decide where are we going and review our stormwater infrastructure. But also our overall planning to our roads, our bridges, all of the hard infrastructure that we're providing, and all of the softer infrastructure around that. And there was a task force that was created, and we implemented some of the types of projects that the conservation authorities have been telling us that we should be doing all along. We implemented some of those. We also put in place some programs, but they were not mandatory programs. They were piloted. One was a disconnection of downspout program, but it was if you want to do it, you can do it. We said, well, you know, if you'd like to purchase rain barrels, you can purchase rain barrels and use these for mitigation. We implemented a subsidy for a backflow valve program, but it wasn't a mandatory program. We didn't have all the data. One of the things that came out of the Cooksville Creek Task Force that was so important was the fact that we did learn was that we need to determine in key areas where there are weaknesses in the system and then actually apply them as programs and educate residents and businesses to actually apply those programs for the betterment. We can't just say, be wishy-washy and say, well, you can try this out if you want to do that. But a great thing that came out of the task force was the fact that we needed to do a review of our whole stormwater infrastructure and look at ways that we could improve the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure, the softer infrastructure, and what those costs would be. And